By the summer of 1963, almost everyone in Hollywood believed they already knew who Elvis Presley was. They thought he was the king. They thought he was untouchable. They thought he walked into every room with the confidence of a man who had conquered the world and had nothing left to prove. But inside the gates of MGM Studios, behind the bright lights, the polished floors, the painted backdrops, and the smiling publicity photographs, Elvis Presley was carrying a silence that very few people noticed. He still smiled when people expected him to smile. He still greeted crew members politely. He still dressed like a star, moved like a star, and stood in front of cameras like a man born for the spotlight. But something inside him had grown tired, not broken, not destroyed, just tired in a way that frightened him more than failure ever had, because failure was something a man could fight. But emptiness was different. Emptiness came quietly. It sat beside him in the car on the way to the studio. It followed him into his dressing room. It waited for him after every take. It whispered the same question again and again. Is this all you are now? A movie star in another safe film. A singer handed another soundtrack. A man surrounded by people, yet somehow more alone than he had ever been. 5 years earlier, the world had screamed his name as if he were a force of nature. He had shaken stages, terrified parents, thrilled teenagers, and changed American music with a sound that felt dangerous because it was alive. Then came the Army. Then came the return. Then came Colonel Tom Parker's plan. Movies, more movies, safe movies, profitable movies, films with songs, songs with records, records with money. The machine worked perfectly. That was the problem. It worked so perfectly that Elvis sometimes felt there was no room left inside it for the man he used to be. On paper, Viva Las Vegas was supposed to be just another film. A handsome racing driver, a hotel singer, bright lights, fast cars, a few songs, a few dances, a simple love story wrapped around a soundtrack. No one expected it to become the film people would remember differently. No one expected anything dangerous. No one expected Elvis Presley to walk into a rehearsal room and find the one person who could see the exhaustion behind his smile. And no one expected that person to be a 22-year-old actress named Ann-Margret. Before she arrived, Ann-Margret had already been warned. Not officially. Hollywood rarely warned people officially. The warnings came in smaller ways. A lowered voice in a hallway, a careful comment from someone who had worked on an Elvis picture before, a polite smile that carried more meaning than the words around it. Just remember, it's his picture. Don't try to outshine him. Stand beside him, not in front of him. They already know what they want from you. She heard all of it, and she understood exactly what they meant. Elvis was the bigger name. Elvis was the brand. Elvis was the reason the studio expected audiences to buy tickets. Ann-Margret was supposed to dance, smile, look beautiful, bring energy, and never forget the invisible line drawn around the star of the film. But Ann-Margret had never built her life by obeying invisible lines. She had come from a family of Swedish immigrants. She had learned early that if she wanted a room to see her, she had to bring more than beauty into it. She brought fire. She brought rhythm. She brought fearlessness. And by 1963, people who had watched her perform knew one thing very clearly. She did not disappear beside anyone. That was why some people were nervous before Elvis and Ann-Margret ever met on the set. Not because she was difficult, not because she was disrespectful, but because she had the kind of presence that could not be placed quietly in the background. And Elvis, whether the studio wanted to admit it or not, was no longer the reckless young force who had once exploded through every performance as if he had nothing to lose. He was controlled now, managed, scheduled, protected, packaged. There were people around him at almost every hour of the day. People who opened doors, people who closed doors, people who answered questions before he had to, people who made sure the star never had to stand alone long enough for anyone to ask what he actually wanted. That morning, on the MGM soundstage, the crew expected the usual rhythm. Lights would be adjusted. The choreographer would arrive. Assistants would carry papers. The director, George Sidney, would study the frame. Elvis would come in with his entourage, polite but guarded. Ann-Margret would arrive prepared and professional. They would rehearse. They would hit their marks. They would begin the machine again. But Elvis arrived early. Not Hollywood early. Not the kind of early that still made other people wait for him. He arrived before the room had fully woken up, before the crew noise filled the air, before the director's voice started shaping the day, before anyone had time to build the wall around him. The soundstage was still half quiet. A few lights glowed overhead, but most of the space remained dim. Cables stretched across the floor. Chairs sat empty. A piano stood near the rehearsal area like something left behind from another scene. Elvis walked toward it without saying much. He sat down. For a moment he only rested his hands on the keys. One of the crew members glanced over, expecting him to play something loud, something playful, something that would remind everyone the king had arrived. But Elvis did not play for them. He played softly, almost privately. A slow melody moved through the room, not polished, not performed, just honest. It was the kind of music a man plays when he thinks no one important is listening. And for the first time that morning, Elvis Presley did not look like a movie star. He looked like a man trying to remember himself. A few minutes later, Ann-Margret entered. She stopped near the doorway. She had expected noise, movement, a production already waiting to pull her into its rhythm. Instead, she heard the piano. She saw Elvis sitting there, slightly hunched, his face turned toward the keys, his expression far away. No entourage standing between him and the world. No cameras, no screaming fans, no Colonel Parker. Just Elvis. For a few seconds, Ann-Margret did not move. Something about the scene felt too personal to interrupt. Then Elvis looked up. Their eyes met. He gave a small smile. Not the famous smile. Not the one audiences knew. A smaller one. Almost embarrassed. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied. There was a pause. The kind of pause that usually becomes awkward between strangers. But this one did not. Elvis looked back at the piano. "You know this one?" Ann-Margret stepped closer. "Maybe." He played the melody again. This time, she listened for only a moment before joining him softly. Her voice entered the room like a match touching dry paper. Not loud, not theatrical, but alive. Elvis did not stop playing. He looked surprised for half a second. Then something in his face changed. The tiredness did not disappear, but it moved, as if for the first time in a long while, something inside him had been interrupted. Ann-Margret sang with him, not because the script told her to, not because the choreographer had counted them in, not because anyone had asked. She simply heard the music and answered it. Around them, the sound stage began to change. A technician carrying a cable slowed down. An assistant with a clipboard stopped near the edge of the room. Someone who had been talking quietly fell silent. No one wanted to be the first person to break it. For a few minutes, MGM Studios, one of the busiest places in Hollywood, became still. Two voices, one piano, and a feeling no one had scheduled. When the last note faded, Elvis kept his hands on the keys. Ann-Margret looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them laughed. Neither of them made a joke. because both of them understood something had happened, even if neither could name it. Finally, Elvis said quietly, "You've got a strong voice." Ann-Margret smiled. "So do you." He lowered his eyes for a moment. The compliment should have been easy for him. He had heard louder praise from thousands of people. He had heard women scream his name until the walls shook. He had been called the king so many times that the word no longer sounded real. But this was different. Because she had not said it like a fan, she had said it like a performer, like someone who knew what it cost to stand under lights and give people energy, even when your own was almost gone. Before Elvis could answer, the door opened wider. The day came rushing in. Crew members entered. The choreographer arrived. George Sidney appeared with notes. Assistants began moving chairs. Someone called for lighting adjustments. The machine woke up. And just like that, the private moment was buried under work. But it did not vanish. Not for Elvis. Not for Ann-Margret. Not for the few people who had been lucky enough to witness it. Rehearsal began the way rehearsals always began. Counts, steps, positions, corrections. Again, again, again. At first, everyone watched carefully. There was always curiosity when two strong performers shared a space for the first time. Would Elvis dominate the frame? Would Ann-Margret pull too much attention? Would the chemistry feel forced? Would the dance numbers work? The first run-through answered almost everything. They moved together as if they had known each other longer than one morning. Elvis had always understood rhythm in his body before he understood it in words. He did not simply follow music. He seemed to hear spaces inside it that other people missed. Ann-Margret heard them too. That was the shock. She did not wait for him. She did not chase him. She met him, step for step, turn for turn, smile for smile, fire for fire. The choreographer watched with his arms folded. George Sidney lowered his notes. A dancer standing nearby whispered, "Well," then said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say. The studio had expected Elvis Presley with a beautiful co-star. What they saw was something more dangerous. They saw two performers waking each other up. During the second run, Elvis laughed, a real laugh, short, surprised, almost boyish. Someone on the crew turned at the sound. It was not that Elvis never laughed on set. He did. He was polite, friendly, professional. But this laugh was different. It came from somewhere unguarded. Ann-Margret had missed a step on purpose, then recovered so quickly that the mistake became part of the movement. Elvis caught it instantly and answered by changing his own timing. The choreographer started to interrupt, then stopped, because what they were doing was better than what had been planned. By noon, the room felt warmer. Not because of the lights, though those were bright enough to make everyone sweat. It felt warmer because Elvis was present in a way many crew members had not seen before. He asked to try a movement again. He suggested a pause before a turn. He leaned toward Ann-Margret and said something that made her grin. Then they ran the number again, and again, and again. Not because they had failed, because neither of them wanted to stop. By late afternoon, a strange uneasiness began moving through the production. Not among the dancers, not among the crew, among the people who watched stars not as artists, but as property. Elvis being bored was manageable. Elvis being obedient was profitable. Elvis doing what the schedule required was safe. But Elvis inspired was another matter. Inspired people made choices. Inspired people asked questions. Inspired people remembered they had power. And Ann-Margret, whether she intended to or not, was reminding Elvis of something everyone around him had worked very hard to contain. She was reminding him that performing could still feel like freedom. That evening, after rehearsal ended, most of the crew began packing up. Ann-Margret gathered her things near the edge of the stage. Elvis stood a few feet away, speaking with one of his men, but his attention kept drifting back toward the empty rehearsal floor. The music had stopped. The lights were being lowered. The room was returning to silence. Ann-Margret turned to leave. "Elvis?" He looked over. She hesitated, then said, "You looked happy today." The words landed harder than she expected. Elvis did not answer immediately. For a second, the famous face disappeared again, and something more vulnerable stood in its place. Then he gave a faint smile. "I guess I forgot what that felt like." Ann-Margret's expression softened. She wanted to say something, maybe something kind, maybe something careful. But before she could, one of Elvis's men called from near the door. "Elvis, Colonel wants a call before you leave." The name changed the room. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Elvis looked toward the door. The small smile faded. The wall began rebuilding itself. He nodded. "Yeah, I'm coming." Then he looked back at Ann-Margret. For one brief moment, neither of them moved. There was no confession, no scandal, no dramatic promise. Just two people standing in a quiet studio after a long day, both understanding that something rare had begun, and both knowing already that rare things in Hollywood were never left alone for long. Elvis walked toward the door. Ann-Margret watched him go. As he disappeared into the hallway, the last stage light above the rehearsal floor flickered once, then went dark. And somewhere inside the studio, behind closed doors, the first whispers began. People had seen the way they looked at each other. People had seen the way Elvis had changed. People had seen the king come alive again. And in Hollywood, nothing alive stayed untouched for long. The whispers spread through MGM Studios far faster than either Elvis or Ann-Margret realized. Nobody said anything directly. Hollywood almost never did. Instead, people watched. They watched during rehearsals. They watched between takes. They watched from behind cameras, lighting rigs, makeup mirrors, and half-open dressing room doors. At first, they thought it was simple professional chemistry. Then they noticed something unusual. Elvis had started arriving even earlier, not because production demanded it, because he wanted those few quiet minutes before the studio became a factory again. Every morning he found himself walking toward the rehearsal hall before anyone asked him to. Sometimes Ann-Margret was already there. Sometimes she arrived a few minutes later. Neither of them planned it. Neither of them admitted they were hoping the other would appear. Yet somehow, morning after morning, they found themselves standing in the same empty room. The piano became their meeting place. Some mornings Elvis played old gospel melodies from his childhood in Memphis. Other mornings he wandered through unfinished melodies that existed only for a few moments before disappearing forever. Ann-Margret never interrupted. She simply listened. Sometimes she joined him. Sometimes she sat quietly, letting the music speak for both of them. Those mornings slowly became Elvis's favorite part of the entire production. Not the cameras, not the applause, not the publicity photographs. Those quiet minutes before sunrise touched the studio windows. Crew members noticed the change almost immediately. The wardrobe department joked that Elvis seemed younger. The makeup artists noticed something even stranger. His eyes looked different. For years they had hidden exhaustion beneath careful smiles. Now they sparkled before filming had even begun. One makeup artist quietly told another, "I haven't seen him like this in years." The other woman simply nodded. Neither needed to say more. Meanwhile, rehearsals became something no one expected. George Sidney had directed musicals for years. He knew talent when he saw it. He also knew when performers were merely following choreography. This was no longer choreography. This was conversation. Without speaking a single word, Elvis and Ann-Margret answered each other's movements. If Elvis slowed half a step, Ann-Margret instinctively matched him. If she spun faster than expected, Elvis adjusted before anyone else even noticed. The choreographer stopped counting aloud. He no longer needed to. The music seemed to count for them. During one rehearsal of the title number, something happened that no one forgot. The orchestra paused halfway through while technicians adjusted microphones. Everyone relaxed. Several dancers stepped away to drink water. The assistant director called for a short break. Officially, rehearsal had stopped. But Elvis never left the floor. Neither did Ann-Margret. Without discussing it, without asking permission, the piano began again. Elvis smiled. "You remember the ending?" Ann-Margret laughed. "I think you forgot it." "Oh? Show me." He stood. The musicians watched with curiosity. The pianist smiled and quietly continued playing. No cameras rolled. No director shouted instructions. No script supervisor took notes. There was nothing official about what happened next. Elvis stepped forward. Ann-Margret answered with perfect timing. The dance grew faster, looser, freer. Every movement looked effortless. Not because it was easy, but because they trusted each other completely. Around them, conversations stopped one by one. A lighting technician froze while carrying equipment. A costume assistant stood motionless with dresses folded across her arms. Even the orchestra members forgot they were supposed to be resting. For nearly 2 minutes, no one breathed loudly enough to interrupt them. George Sidney walked into the room halfway through. He didn't speak. He simply watched. When the final note faded, silence remained. Then, someone quietly applauded. Another joined. Within seconds, the entire sound stage erupted. Not because anyone had been instructed to clap, because everyone understood they had just witnessed something impossible to manufacture. George Sidney slowly walked toward them. For a moment, neither Elvis nor Ann-Margret knew whether they were about to be criticized. Instead, the director smiled. "I've spent my whole career trying to create moments like that." He looked around the room. "You two just did it by accident." Nobody answered, because everyone knew he was right. Word of that rehearsal spread beyond the soundstage before lunch. Executives began visiting rehearsals more frequently. Publicists suddenly requested additional promotional photographs. Magazine reporters started asking unusual questions. What are they like together? Do they rehearse after hours? Why does Elvis seem different on this picture? The production office politely dismissed every rumor. Professional respect. Nothing more. That became the official answer. But, unofficially, people kept watching. One afternoon, filming moved outdoors to Las Vegas. The desert heat wrapped around the crew like a heavy blanket. Hundreds of extras waited patiently beneath the blazing sun. Bright casino lights reflected off polished cars, prepared for the racing scenes. Everything looked glamorous, almost magical, until something unexpected happened. During a difficult sequence, one of the younger dancers stumbled while landing awkwardly. She cried out in pain. The assistant director immediately called for a pause. Most people stepped back. Doctors hurried toward her. Before anyone noticed, Elvis was already kneeling beside her. "So, where does it hurt?" His voice carried no celebrity, only concern. The frightened dancer pointed toward her ankle. Ann-Margret arrived only seconds later. Without hesitation, she removed the scarf from around her neck. "Here." She folded it carefully beneath the injured girl's leg while the medic examined her. The young dancer looked up with tears filling her eyes. I'm sorry." Elvis gently shook his head. "You've got nothing to apologize for. We're making a movie. People matter more than movies." Several crew members quietly exchanged surprised looks. One elderly grip whispered, "That's the Elvis people don't get to see." Ann-Margret heard the comment. She looked toward Elvis. He hadn't heard it. He was too busy helping the medic lift the frightened dancer onto a stretcher. That afternoon changed something else. Not between Elvis and Ann-Margret. Between Elvis and the crew. People stopped seeing only the world's biggest entertainer. They started seeing the man underneath. A man who remembered names. A man who thanked electricians. A man who laughed with background dancers. A man who stayed behind after filming simply because someone wanted to show him a better version of a musical arrangement. For Elvis, the movie was no longer another contract. It had become a place where he wanted to remain. But not everyone welcomed the transformation. Several days later, Colonel Tom Parker arrived on set. His appearance immediately changed the atmosphere. Conversations became shorter. Smiles became more careful. Assistants straightened their jackets. Production executives hurried to greet him. The colonel observed everything without speaking. His eyes moved slowly across the rehearsal floor. They stopped on Elvis, then shifted toward Ann-Margret. Neither performer noticed immediately. They were too busy working through another dance sequence. The colonel watched in silence, long enough for everyone nearby to grow uncomfortable. Finally, he turned toward one of the studio executives. "They're getting a lot of attention together." The executive forced a smile. "Audiences love chemistry." The colonel didn't smile back. "They're supposed to love Elvis." Nothing more was said. But the sentence hung in the air long after he walked away. Late that evening, filming finally ended. Most of the cast headed back to their hotels. The soundstage grew quiet once again. Elvis remained behind. He sat alone at the piano. The lights were already being switched off one section at a time. Footsteps echoed softly across the empty room. He didn't have to look up. He already knew who it was. Ann-Margret stopped beside the piano. "You stayed again." Elvis smiled faintly. "So did you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ann-Margret looked across the enormous empty stage. "Funny." "What is?" "This room feels completely different when everyone leaves." Elvis nodded slowly. "It feels honest." She looked toward him. "You miss that, don't you?" He didn't answer immediately. His fingers rested gently on the piano keys. Then, very quietly, "So much it scares me." Ann-Margret lowered her eyes. She understood exactly what he meant. Not because he had explained it, because performers always recognized loneliness inside another performer. Outside the studio, the Las Vegas skyline glowed beneath the desert night. Inside, only one spotlight remained burning above the piano. Elvis pressed a single note. Its sound drifted slowly through the empty hall. Neither of them realized that, from the darkness beyond the stage, someone else had stopped to watch. Someone connected to the production. Someone who had already begun reporting every quiet conversation back to Colonel Parker. And by the following morning, decisions would begin to be made that neither Elvis nor Ann-Margret could yet imagine. Next morning, nothing looked different. The same soundstage, the same cameras, the same dancers warming up beneath the bright studio lights, the same assistants hurrying across the floor with scripts tucked beneath their arms. To anyone walking into MGM Studios that morning, it looked like another ordinary day of filming. But for the people who had worked in Hollywood long enough, the air felt heavier. Something invisible had changed overnight. Elvis sensed it before anyone spoke a single word. Crew members still smiled, but their smiles ended too quickly. Conversations stopped the moment he walked past. Several production assistants glanced toward Colonel Parker before answering even the simplest questions. It wasn't obvious. It never was. Control in Hollywood rarely arrived with shouting. It arrived with silence. Ann-Margret noticed it too. During makeup, one of the hairstylists almost mentioned something, then stopped herself. Another assistant apologized for absolutely nothing. Even George Sidney seemed distracted. The director continued giving instructions with his usual confidence, yet every few minutes his eyes drifted toward Colonel Parker, who sat quietly near the monitors, watching everything without expression. He rarely interrupted. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew he was watching. Filming continued, scene after scene, song after song. But something remarkable happened despite the growing tension. The pressure didn't separate Elvis and Ann-Margret. It did the opposite. Every difficult scene somehow became stronger. The famous dance numbers became sharper. The emotional scenes felt more believable. Instead of distracting each other, they elevated each other. George Sidney finally laughed during one rehearsal. "I've spent weeks trying to improve these scenes." He looked at both of them. "You two improve them simply by looking at each other." The room erupted in quiet laughter. Even Elvis smiled. But Colonel Parker remained completely still. His face revealed nothing. That afternoon, production moved to the enormous casino staircase, prepared for the title number. Hundreds of extras filled the luxurious lobby. Bright chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. Dozens of dancers waited silently for instructions. This would become one of the biggest musical sequences in the entire film. Everything had to be perfect. The assistant director called for positions. "Cameras ready. Playback ready. Stand by." The orchestra began. Elvis stepped onto the staircase. Ann-Margret joined him. The music exploded through the building. For the next several minutes, nobody watching remembered they were standing inside a movie set. The movement was effortless. The smiles looked real. Their energy seemed endless. Every turn connected perfectly. Every glance carried genuine excitement. Even experienced crew members found themselves smiling without realizing it. When George Sidney finally shouted, "Cut!" silence followed. Not because anyone had made a mistake, because no one wanted the moment to end. Then, applause filled the enormous room. The dancers clapped, the musicians clapped, electricians standing high above the lighting platforms clapped. Even several casino employees watching from the balcony applauded. George Sidney slowly removed his glasses. "I don't think we can improve that." He looked toward the script supervisor. "Print it." Everyone relaxed, except one man. Colonel Parker quietly stood. He walked toward Elvis. The entire room instinctively became quieter. "Good work," Elvis nodded politely. "Thank you." The colonel glanced briefly toward Ann-Margret before looking back at Elvis. "I'd like a word." The two men walked away from the crowd. They stopped near an empty hallway beyond the stage. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, the colonel folded his arms. "You've been enjoying this picture," Elvis answered honestly. "Yeah, I can tell." Another silence. Then came the question. "Don't forget why you're here." Elvis frowned slightly. "I'm here to make the best picture we can." The colonel's expression remained calm. "No. You're here to protect the Elvis Presley brand." Those words lingered between them. Elvis lowered his eyes. He had heard similar speeches for years. Business, marketing, public image, profits, schedules. Always the same conversation. Never about music, never about joy, never about why he had started singing in the first place. The colonel continued. "People don't buy tickets for chemistry. They buy tickets for Elvis. You understand that?" Elvis didn't answer, because deep inside, he wasn't sure he did anymore. That evening, long after filming ended, He returned to the rehearsal room once again. Only one lamp remained switched on. The piano waited exactly where it always had. He sat down. His fingers rested above the keys, but this time, nothing came. No melody, no inspiration, only silence. For the first time since meeting Ann-Margret, the old emptiness returned. He closed his eyes. Perhaps the Colonel was right. Perhaps this was becoming dangerous. Perhaps he was forgetting how carefully his life had been arranged. He quietly stood to leave. Then he heard footsteps. Ann-Margret. She stopped a few feet away. "You weren't playing." He forced a smile. "I couldn't." She studied his face. "What happened?" Elvis looked away toward the empty soundstage. "The machine remembered I belonged to it." The sentence broke something inside her. She understood immediately. Nobody had to explain who the machine was. Contracts, schedules, expectations, image, money. Everything surrounding the man, except the man himself. She slowly walked toward the piano. Without asking permission, she sat beside him. For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. Then Ann-Margret gently placed her fingers on the keys. She played the melody Elvis had been playing on their very first morning together. Softly, patiently, exactly the way he had. Elvis listened. At first he remained completely still. Then, almost without thinking, his right hand joined hers. Two melodies became one again. Neither looked at the other. They didn't need to. The music said everything words could not. Across the empty room, George Sidney had quietly returned to collect forgotten notes. He stopped in the doorway. He watched the two performers sitting together beneath the lone spotlight. He never interrupted. Years later, when people asked him what made Viva Las Vegas different from every other Elvis film, he would remember this exact image. Not the cameras, not the costumes, not the famous dance numbers. Just two artists sitting beside a piano, helping each other remember why they loved performing. When the final note faded, Ann-Margret smiled. "You found it again." Elvis looked down at the piano. "No," he looked back at her. "You helped me find it." She didn't answer. Her eyes said enough. Outside, night had completely settled over Hollywood. Inside the empty soundstage, only the piano remained. Only the silence remained. Only the understanding that whatever existed between them, it had already changed both of their lives. Neither of them knew what the future would bring. They didn't know whether they would ever work together again. They didn't know whether the industry surrounding them would allow this rare creative partnership to survive. But one truth had become impossible to deny. For the first time in many years, Elvis Presley no longer walked onto a movie set feeling like a man completing another contract. He walked onto that stage feeling like an artist again, and that feeling would become the greatest gift Ann-Margret ever gave him. Yet neither of them realized that the final days of filming were approaching, and with them would come the quiet goodbye neither of them was truly prepared to face. The final week of filming arrived more quietly than anyone expected. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no dramatic speech reminding everyone that the journey was almost over. The calendar simply kept moving, one page after another, one scene after another, until everyone on the production slowly realized there were only a handful of days left. For the crew, it meant another film completed. For MGM, it meant another picture ready for theaters. For Colonel Parker, it meant another successful business transaction. But for Elvis, it meant saying goodbye to the happiest weeks he had experienced in years. He tried not to think about it. Instead, he focused on the work, every scene, every line, every rehearsal, every dance. He wanted each moment to last just a little longer. The crew noticed. Whenever George Sidney called, "Cut!" Elvis no longer hurried toward his dressing room. He remained on the set, talking with musicians, laughing with dancers, listening while technicians adjusted equipment, almost as if leaving the stage too quickly would make everything disappear. Ann-Margret noticed it before anyone else. One afternoon, after finishing another musical sequence, she quietly walked beside him. "You don't want this to end." Elvis smiled without looking at her. "No." After a moment, he added, "I don't think I've wanted anything to keep going this much in a long time." She nodded. "I know." Neither of them tried to explain it. They didn't have to. Sometimes the deepest friendships grow from experiences that cannot be translated into words. As filming entered its final days, George Sidney gathered the principal cast together after one particularly difficult sequence. He looked around the room, then smiled. "I've directed a lot of pictures," he paused, "but very few have surprised me." His eyes settled on Elvis, then on Ann-Margret. "The two of you reminded everyone here what real chemistry looks like." The room erupted into warm applause. The dancers smiled. The orchestra applauded. Several veteran crew members exchanged emotional glances. One elderly camera operator quietly wiped his eyes. He had worked in Hollywood for nearly 3 decades. He had filmed some of the biggest stars in America. Yet somehow, these few months had become the production he knew he would remember most. The final day arrived, long before sunrise. The studio looked almost exactly as it had on the first morning. Empty, quiet. The piano still stood in the corner, almost waiting. Elvis arrived first, just as he had months earlier. He walked slowly across the stage. His fingertips brushed against costumes hanging nearby. He paused beside the racing car used throughout the film. He smiled at the now familiar rehearsal floor. Every corner carried a memory. Every light reminded him of laughter. Every mark taped onto the floor reminded him how alive he had felt. He sat at the piano one last time, without thinking. He began playing the same gentle melody that had welcomed Ann-Margret on their very first morning together. Only this time, he knew it would be the last. A few moments later, soft footsteps echoed across the empty soundstage. Ann-Margret stopped beside him. Neither of them seemed surprised, almost as though they had both known exactly where the other would be. "You remembered," Elvis continued playing. "I couldn't forget." She smiled. Neither of them spoke again until the final note faded into the silent room. Then Ann-Margret quietly asked, "Do you think we'll ever have another picture like this?" Elvis looked around the enormous empty studio. His eyes rested on the lights above, the cameras, the piano. Finally, he answered honestly, "I don't know." He paused. "But I don't think I'll ever feel exactly like this again." The words remained suspended between them. Not dramatic, not tragic, simply true. Within the hour, the crew arrived. The last scene was prepared. Everyone sensed the emotion hanging over the set. Even those who normally joked during filming spoke more softly. George Sidney stepped forward. He looked at the entire cast and crew, then toward Elvis and Ann-Margret. "Let's make this one count." The cameras rolled. The final performance unfolded beautifully. Nobody rushed. Nobody wanted to. When George Sidney finally shouted, "That's a wrap!" for a heartbeat, no one moved. Then applause exploded across the soundstage. Crew members embraced one another. Dancers laughed through tears. Musicians packed away their instruments while still smiling. Someone uncorked a bottle of champagne. Someone else began taking photographs. Elvis stood quietly in the middle of it all, watching, listening, trying to memorize every sound. George Sidney walked toward him. "You gave me your best picture." Elvis shook his head gently. "No." He looked toward Ann-Margret. "We gave you your best picture." George smiled. "I think you're right." Later that afternoon, the costumes were returned. The sets began coming apart. Painted walls disappeared. Lights were lowered. The world they had lived inside for months slowly dissolved piece by piece. Hollywood had already started building another dream. As evening settled over Culver City, Elvis prepared to leave. His car waited outside. Several members of his entourage stood nearby. Colonel Parker was already discussing future schedules, more films, more contracts, more obligations. The machine had started moving again. Before getting into the car, Elvis turned back one final time. Ann-Margret was standing near the entrance to the now empty soundstage. Neither walked toward the other. Neither needed a dramatic farewell. They simply stood there, smiling, understanding. "Thankful." Elvis raised one hand. Ann-Margret did the same. Then he quietly climbed into the car. As it disappeared beyond the studio gates, neither of them knew they would never again share another film the way they had shared this one. Months later, Viva Las Vegas premiered. Audiences immediately noticed something critics struggled to explain. The songs were wonderful, the dancing was unforgettable, but what truly stayed with people was the feeling. Viewers believed the joy they saw on screen, because it wasn't manufactured, it wasn't created by clever editing, it wasn't something written into the screenplay. It had been real. Reviewers praised the extraordinary chemistry between Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret. Fans returned to theaters again and again. Many called it the finest film of Elvis's Hollywood career. Even decades later, whenever people ranked his movies, Viva Las Vegas almost always stood near the very top. Time continued moving forward. Elvis returned to other productions. Some succeeded, some disappeared. The familiar routine returned, yet many people who worked beside him quietly admitted they never again saw quite the same light in his eyes that had filled those months in 1963. Ann-Margret continued building her remarkable career. Whenever interviewers asked about Elvis, she answered with kindness, with respect, never with gossip, never with scandal, only gratitude. Years passed, the world changed, friends grew older, some passed away. Hollywood itself became almost unrecognizable. Yet one memory refused to fade. Not the famous staircase, not the racing scenes, not the applause. The memory people carried with them was far simpler. An empty soundstage, an old piano, a young woman walking through the door, a tired man playing quietly to himself, two performers making music before anyone else arrived. No cameras, no audience, no publicity, just honesty. Perhaps that is why the story has endured for generations. Not because it revealed a secret romance, not because it uncovered hidden scandal, but because, for one brief season, two extraordinary artists reminded each other why they had fallen in love with performing in the first place. Sometimes the greatest gift one person gives another is not fame, not success, not even love. Sometimes the greatest gift is helping someone remember who they were before the world told them who they had to become. For Elvis Presley, those quiet mornings inside an empty MGM soundstage became exactly that. A reminder, a refuge, a return to himself. And although the sets disappeared, the lights were switched off, the cameras were packed away, and the music eventually faded into history, the feeling born in that silent room never truly left. because long after the final curtain falls, the moments that change us are rarely the loudest. They are the quiet ones, shared with someone who simply understands.